Good morning. We start with Ebola in New York City. Dr. Craig Spence, the latest American to contract the disease, remains hospitalized at Bellevue Hospital. But there is growing controversy over the mandatory quarantine issued by the governors of New York, New Jersey, Illinois, and Florida. That quarantine applies to all passengers coming back into the U.S. who have come in direct contact with Ebola patients in West Africa. We start our coverage with Dr. Anthony Fauci of the National Institutes of Health. Good morning.
Good morning.
Do these quarantines go against science?
Well,
because you've always insisted we should start with the science.
Well, first of all, the most important thing to protect the American people, and as you said, you got to base your decision and your policy on scientific evidence and scientific principles. When we're talking about healthcare workers coming back, they are at different levels of risk depending on their experience, and you tailor the kinds of monitoring, passively, actively, direct, according to that kind of risk. The idea of a blanket quarantine for people who come back could possibly have a negative consequence of essentially disincentivizing people from wanting to go there. And the reason that's important, Charlie, is because the best way to protect Americans is to stop the epidemic in Africa, and we need those healthcare workers to do that. So to put them in a position when they come back that no matter what, automatically they're under quarantine can actually have unintended consequences. And that's the reason why we're concerned about that.
I suppose the governors would say two things. Number one, if you look at monitoring, it doesn't seem necessarily to work, self-monitoring.
Right.
And two, we have a responsibility to make sure that panic doesn't set in.
That is correct, and that's appreciated and understood. When you look at the kinds of monitoring continually on an everyday basis, making sure we're getting it right and doing it right. And as you'll see, the monitoring protocols that'll be put into place will be able to be tailored according to the scientific evaluation of the risk. So when you put everyone in the same basket, that's the thing that we're concerned about.
In fact, the nurse who's now in quarantine said, "I am scared that like me, they will arrive and see a frenzy of disorganization, fear, and most frightening, quarantine, and therefore a disincentive to come."
Right. And that's exactly what we're concerned about. It's totally understandable, and not being critical of people who make that decision and understand why they may want to do that. But we have to keep emphasizing, be careful and make sure that what your decisions and policy are based on scientific data and scientific evaluation.
Do we have more on Dr. Craig Spencer?
Well, I can't comment on his personal care, Charlie, because I'm not directly taking care of him. I just have to see what I read in the media.
But getting back to the science, can you get Ebola from a bowling ball that's been in the hands of someone?
You have to come into direct contact with the body fluids of someone who's sick with Ebola. If a person who's without symptoms and not sick has a bowling ball, that is essentially no risk. I mean, it's so vanishingly small as to be unmeasurable.
In West Africa, is it moving to some kind of tipping point, or is it slowing down?
Well, you can't tell because a lot of cases now are becoming unreported. We know from the people who are there, from our own people, that it is still raging. It still needs a considerable amount more effort on the global community to try and stop that, particularly trained healthcare workers, hospital beds, the things that would put down an epidemic. So it's still a serious problem.
As someone who understands Ebola and at the forefront of this battle today, have you learned any new science based on what's happened so far, or is it simply a new experience from the numbers involved?
It's much more a new experience and different circumstances, but the fundamental scientific principles of how it's transmitted has not been changed. The fundamental principles of contact tracing being paramount to your methodology of suppressing it. That hasn't changed. The experience of an explosion of an epidemic in a highly populated area and exportation out, that experience certainly is new.
Of all the things that you have seen so far, what is it that you think must be rebutted so as not to cause fear?
Well, I think that rather than rebut is to just keep stating the fundamental principles. When someone is without symptoms, if you do not come into contact with their body fluid, this is not spread the way other diseases like influenza or other types of respiratory diseases are spread, where you and I could be talking and I'm a little bit sick and I go like that and you could get you don't get Ebola that way. That's the thing we have to make absolutely certain. Look at the experience. The only 2 people in the United States who've gotten Ebola are brave healthcare nurses who have taken care of a patient who was seriously ill.
What's the most important thing we've learned so far?
Well, we've learned that we've got to be more, continue to be aggressive in our educating people to understand. Because right now we have a devastating epidemic in West Africa, and we're having an epidemic of fear in the United States. So we've got to continue to try and educate people about what they need to or do not need to be afraid of.
And so far, if there are no symptoms, there's no contagion.
Right. You have to come into direct contact with body fluids. As someone who's standing there looking well, they're not going to transmit it.
Do we know more about Amber Benson?
Amber Vincent, I'm just hearing from reports, is doing really quite well, but that's just secondhand. I haven't taken care of it. Nina, I have. Nina is doing great. She's back home, feeling well.
Nina Pham.
Nina Pham. She just sent me an email 10 minutes ago saying, "How you doing? I miss you."
Thank you very much, Dr.
Right.
Fauci.
Right.